Edhe Peter vjen një prej një gjeneratës që ka pas frikë me challenge me pas ideja kreative dhe me pas ideja pa frikë për their consequences. Peter Kuki ndryshe ka studiu në ku edhe ka qenë edhe profesor, ka qenë profesor I shumë arkitekt of function, që ka qenë të influencuar për ti, po pala shumë e zgjatë, kisha pas qef që mja dha fjallë në Peterit, se më siguri për ndukë që ka qenë e gjatë dhe ligjeratës, që është të parë. Peter.
To which I can only hope that that was true, whatever it said. Good evening. I've got a lot of material to show. I'm told that you have a habit of coming and going through the door. I shall try to pretend that you don't, but if you do, tough shit. And I'm going to get straight into it by saying that, of course, here I am in probably one of the most landlocked places that I've spoken for a long time. But I come from the seaside. So that whatever other cultural or architectural differences or psychological differences we might have about going inside and outside doors and scraping chairs, you have to bear in mind that I come from the seaside, and we're very funny people at the seaside. In fact, it was very useful to have come from the seaside because the English are rather uptight, or at first, when you first know them, are rather uptight, except when they're at the seaside, when they do very, very silly things. And my problem is that, of course, I have continued to do very, very silly things, remembering this. One of the seaside towns I lived in as a child, behind on the left, is a tiny town that you won't have heard of called Felixstowe, which at the age of 12 and 13, when I lived there, I still remembered that picture, and in fact I think it's still pretty much like that right now, which is a combination of on a lunar park, of a helter-skelter, a restaurant, and a crazy house. But in fact, of course, what I realized later was the helter-skelter was in fact a kind of megastructure. And the crazy house was a kind of piece of expressionist architecture. And in fact, the restaurant was that rare commodity, an Art Deco building in the eastern part of England. I then moved to Bournemouth, a much larger seaside town, where I also went to my first architecture school. And one of the characteristics of Bournemouth that I know and still remember is the cliff lift. In fact, there were 2 or 3 cliff lifts. And I didn't bother about them. They were just a way of, if you had a lot of money, paying a penny and going down the cliff. If you were very tired, paying another penny and coming up the lift. Or you just walked. And in fact, of course, later, with the Archigram group and all my friends, I became associated with the idea that architecture and technology have a lot to say to each other. But this was a piece of technology, a piece of probably late 19th century technology, which you just lived with it. It was there. It was the cliff lift. You didn't say, that's technology and the rest is Bournemouth. No, cliff lift. There you go. Get up, go down. And I think this nonchalance of the seaside, the fact that the seaside town absorbs twice as many people in the summer and has to metamorphose to some extent to accommodate them. Things come out of the cupboard, pieces of canvas are unwrapped, lamps are lit, pieces of wood are put together and people appear. And then in the autumn, the thing returns, it metamorphoses backwards. And the notion of such things as plug-in city, which is in a sense a metamorphic concept, possibly were seeded as a seaside child. The other thing about Bournemouth, of course, was that it was a 19th century development, largely, and was for the people of the industrial north to go and live by the seaside, get the fresh air and the waters and so on, and probably live another 10 years. And it's full of neo-Gothic churches and pineland walks and many trees and funny little buildings that actually do something, such as this, which is a water tower, pretending to be a piece of sort of romantic English picturesque. So there's a whole lot of that, consciously or subconsciously, in my background. On the other hand, I went then to the local architecture school, which was the last place in England where you had to learn the 5 orders of architecture and draw them, and to draw ornament from the 19th century, and to trace buildings with pieces of lead. And then, in other words, it was a very old-fashioned school. The irony of the fact was that even though I started at this school at 16, I had already been reading about architecture a great deal. I was already a modernist. I was actually excited by things like this. Gunnar Asplund's Paradiso restaurant of 1930, of course, a temporary building which was gone long before I was born, and which I've never ever seen other than in a black and white photograph. But even to that child, that 15-year-old, when I probably saw it in a book, it was wonderful. Quite unlike all these old neo-Gothic churches and castles that I used to collect as a child. It was quite unlike the 40 Gothic churches that existed in Norwich, where I also lived as a child. You live in a town of 40 medieval churches. You get rather used to them, actually. But this was something else. This was almost like an aeroplane. It almost floated. It was amazing and amazing and extraordinary. And I was into that before I was forced to copy tracery of old buildings. So it's a very curious background. It's not a straight one. I then later had the advantage of going to the same school as Elia. In fact, I was the year just ahead of Elia's year, but joined it later. And in fact, it was the marvellous, as it was then, the Architectural Association. But after graduating from there, I started to meet some rather interesting people, none of whom had gone to the same school. Archigram is 6 people, 2 of them now sadly dead, all of whom had gone to different schools of architecture, who ranged in age over 10 years, and had completely different tastes in music, clothes, women, food, you name it. We were very different from each other, but we had certain shared enthusiasms. And in fact, I think the strength of the group was that we were that bit different, and therefore sometimes we teamed up in 2s or in 3s or in sometimes even competing against each other. So the dynamic was a very fulsome dynamic, and we were, of course, inspired not only by people that we read about, but interestingly, because I myself had been taught by Peter Smithson and to some extent by a man called Arthur Korn, I had a strong influence coming from discussions that were going on in the rest of Europe. Ron Heron had been directly taught by Julius Posner, who linked through to the German expression scene, and in fact David Green had a month being taught directly by Buckminster Fuller. I mention these things because I think it was important that a part of Archigram was also, in a sense, direct influence by very powerful influences outside, and then in fact admixing our own influences. I was being asked this morning about the plug-in city, to what extent the plug-in city was kind of mechanistic or not. And I think you have to bear in mind that my day job, I was working on system building, prefabricated housing. And in a way, the plug-in city was a kind of commentary upon that said there are certain aspects of prefabrication and modularization and components and the car industry, things dropping off cranes, that can be treated not only pragmatically, but in fact quite romantically. The other thing was, of course, my career from then until now. I still am doing a bit of teaching, and frighteningly, that is a 50-year time. It will be 50 years in 2 months' time. I got into teaching a very simple way. I entered some competitions and finally won a small one about a year and a half after leaving the A, and wrote to the A and said, "Hello, you may have noticed my project. Can I come on crit?" And remarkably, they said yes. And I went on so many crits that I got booted out of got sacked from the office for being in the A all the time. And after 2 years of being, I presume, a very useful critic, I was invited to come into the school. But here is a funny thing. I have never, since that moment, had the benefit of anonymity, because this project, The Plug-in City, was published about 6 weeks before I started teaching. And it was published in a very popular newspaper. A million or more people read this paper. It was in colour. And there it was, and I was this loony who'd done this project. And many of the students who sat there became my friends after and said, you know, we saw you, we thought, fuck, did we have to do that? What's going to happen? And I never therefore had the benefit of anonymity as I should have done, as a rather humble person on the AA's list, because I was the assistant to the 5th year master. Now the assistant is usually a sort of spotty character who runs along behind, very, very helpful, and if the grand professor, you know, burps or something, there's immediately a towel going on. I mean, it's a subservient role, but I had not that anonymity. I was the guy who'd done this extraordinary thing. And of course, what happened was that for decades afterwards, I was Peter Cook, Plug-in City. It's almost like being a sandwich man. You had the board in front of you saying, Plug-in City. What happened in the year 2000 with my friend Colin Fournier, as we won the competition and built the Kunsthaus in Graz. Suddenly, that was something again, there was, fuck, it's that guy who did that thing with the bubbles on it. I now have a back to the sandwich board. I have a front sandwich which says Plug-in City, and there's a board on the back that says Kunsthaus Graz, which is very useful for journalists, because that's all they need to know. In fact, I often say at lectures in the last 10 years, I did Plug-in City when I was a young architect, Kunsthaus Graz when I was an old architect. Now you know, now you can go. So anybody needs to think, they've got the bare outlines of the situation. They say, it's the guy in blue glasses, Plug-in City, Kunsthaus Graz, simple system. And I like simple systems because, you know, sometimes the rest drops away. The rest of this lecture, which will be about 200 pictures, will now confuse the issue. Will confuse that rather simple concept of who this creature was that you brought to Kosovo. After the Plug-in City, there were many iterations of kind of experimental houses and projects. In a way, many of them bore the term city, as does your conference, and in fact, many of them bore the term house. They were anti-houses, anti-cities, replacements of houses, replacements of cities. And looking back at it, I regard that, in fact, as reflecting upon the importance to one's culture of the concept of the house and the concept of the city. And one wish to destroy and recreate those concepts, I think, is very central. There have been other things that one has done. One has played with towers. I have not yet, now, in these recent years when I've started doing buildings, nobody's come to me for a tower. We've done a few competitions for towers, but so far, no success. But I have been interested in towers as a commentary upon the city. I go and I make it a rule that I don't do a tower project unless I've known that city for at least about 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. And in Oslo, which I have been to many times, I was fascinated by the idea of the lantern. The fact in this dark northern place, the idea of the lantern becomes very important. And in the daytime, there are certain colours which are being used by the painters of Norway and by the modernist architects of the Funkist movement, also using those same colours that the painters use, which are in fact colours that you find on the plateau lands behind Oslo. And to use this on a project was interesting. But I just put into the lecture, again, after a long absence, something for you, which I didn't show the last time I gave a similar lecture, because I wanted to talk in particular this evening about people. And I think my wife, who's sitting in the front row there, will say that she has observed over the many years that she's known me, that I've become more and more interested in people as a trigger for projects or as a commentary upon projects. I did a project in the 70s called Arcadia, it doesn't exist. It is, in a sense, as a kind of amalgam of memories of a child. Memories of childhood. Memories of childhood, and bye-bye to the ladies now. Memories of childhood, which in East Anglia, which is a part of England that is fairly flat with a lot of tidal estuaries, a period of my life when I was adolescent. But of course it's not a mimicry of them, but in a sense the memory of the kind of topography and the kind of climate and the kind of English provinciality, a very particular sort of neo-bourgeois English provinciality, which isn't really bourgeois in the sense of French bourgeois, but has certain overtones. And what you can do with the city. So this city, if you look, it's A, B, C, D, E, F. Here is A, which is for people who are very towny. These are people who spend most of their time in the bathroom. And in fact, even in the small apartment, I give them 2 bathrooms. And they spend most of their time out and about and very little cooking. So the kitchen, even in the 70s, was very systematized. And they have translucent walls between them and the neighbours. You can't actually see what the neighbours are doing, but you can see a sort of shadowy movement. Like that, I would like to try it on the building, but bringing the light right into the middle of the building through sort of translucent but not transparent walls. Another group of people, I think I'd started by this time to travel to and from New York a few times, and I was fascinated by the sorts of people who at that time were living in the lofts in Soho. They wouldn't be able to remotely afford to live in the lofts in Soho right now. They were sort of young, active people, and here is some kind of domestic situation where the window cleaner is listening sort of to the strange conversations going on between the 2 women, and they live in a very tough, hard, metallic kind of Soho loft, but which has a sort of fruity top to it. This is a very cynical view of a certain kind of English family where the father is rather pompously talking about French wine all the time, but not really understanding it. The daughter is rather naughty, and the mother likes to just let it all hang out and sit on the soft settee. But they play cricket, and so there's room in the front of the buildings for them to play cricket. Or here was what was at the time absolutely normal family. They should have 1.5 children. And a small car, and they live in a very simple series of 1-floor apartments, but the system of access is quite tricky. So you make it appear to be simple, but there are special locality things going on. I'm fascinated by that contrast. These are a couple of people on a peninsula who are probably old Viennese, who perhaps were Jewish Viennese who escaped, brought their special things with them, they brought their sophistication with them, and in the English provinces that sets them apart. And they live in rather protected housing with a park and water. You kind of look after them. And they, of course, had real plants. The first people had plastic plants, because they don't have time. Plants are in the bathroom all the time, or parties. But these people, of course, tend their plants very carefully. They spend a lot of time reading, a lot of time polishing the furniture, and having memories, and listening to music. And these were young romantics, dreamers, students maybe living by the water. Now these are very old projects, and I wouldn't remotely do the architecture like that right now. But I am still interested in observing types of people, groups of people, and the kinds of value systems that they have. I probably get them wrong, but nonetheless it intrigues me that when you go into somebody's apartment for the first time, if they're an architect, they will of course have the Rem Koolhaas book. So your eye goes past that and looks to see the things that are not typical. And out of that one forms a kind of view of their habits. And so when I go to the cities and do do the towers, I also have the same observation. If I'm in Australia, I'm fascinated by how there is this sort of breezy, let it all hang out kind of thing, and that was a pair of towers I did for Australia. Or if I'm in my wife's city, which is Tel Aviv, I'm fascinated by how you deal with a hot climate and a noisy ground condition. Now, I have to here admit to something where I'm still unfulfilled. I have often been fascinated by vegetation. I've been fascinated by the possibility of vegetation, not only as an adjunct to the literacy of architecture, but in fact something that almost has tectonic qualities in of itself. And I've been interested a long time. So far, though I have started to build, I have yet to build anything which involves vegetation, though it is still running around in my head. So this is a frustrated territory. And here we see a piece of vegetation which I was shown after I'd given a lecture. So I went to Karlsruhe many, many years ago, gave a lecture, and a guy there's often somebody who comes up to you at the end of a lecture and they say, there's something up the road just like your thing. Sometimes they say, it was something that somebody did in 1763, you know, it's all been done, and they expect you to sort of flagellate yourself, and fall on the floor and say, oh, all has been done, all is lost. Or you say, bloody good idea, wasn't it? And in this case, it is the orangery of the Schloss Karlsruhe, where there is an armature which was done in the 19th century, intending vegetation to grow up it so that it would form a kind of room. Some very boring person said, no, it must have had glass in it. But no, I have seen the original drawings. It does not have glasses. It is meant to be vegetated. Down the street from there in Schwetzingen, there are all sorts of examples of vegetated structure. And I have attempted in, for example, this project, which I call the Veg House, to see what would happen in a highly technologized house if you allowed the vegetation, if you encouraged the vegetation to become part of the party. So here we see the plan, triangular plan, the cover of the thing, the power pack, the car park, the bed, and so on. And on the top right, you see a sort of picture of what it might look like. And it is a mixture of electrical apparatus, electronic apparatus, built stuff, gadgets, bits of Archigram, if you like. And then time moves on and the vegetation moves into it. Along the armatures, some of the original pieces position themselves differently, but the cover, the basic proposition is there. And then more vegetation comes in, starts to enclose, it starts to grow vines, it starts to have some hybrids which are combinations of sort of comfy furniture and vegetation, or hi-fi systems and leaves. It grows more, becomes mysterious, and I start to invoke a series of old English kind of terms such as glade and fold and weave. So it's this very gentle progress. And then it gets weirder. And then it gets weirder still. And at this point I say, stop. The project has sort of gone too far. I don't know where one would have stopped it. But I'm fascinated by metamorphosis, as you can see. And if you have a veg house, you can have a veg village. A series of these that are weaving and subcurating, affecting each other. And in fact, one can try and figure out where that comes from. Probably from the conceptual notion of that there is no such thing as a perfect situation. That many situations are capable of metamorphosis. But also, I think, a fascination with marshland, which again is in that eastern part of England that I come from, where it is both solid and water. It can be partly one and partly the other. There's no absolutely defining line that says this is it and where it is, where it solidifies. Much more recently, about 3-4 years ago, I made a drawing, a complicated drawing of a vegetated territory. what I was interested here was to actually pose myself ambiguities, to say it is vegetated. If you look carefully, you can see the blue bit moving up, which probably is man-made. They are organised pieces, rather like a kind of glass log jam. Then if you look more closely, you can see there are other pieces that have some degree of structuring and leave you wondering ambiguously, is it a structure? Is it a vegetation? Is it some sort of architecture that has kind of veggie overtones? And if we take the whole drawing, which is much larger, then one inserts some deliberately provocative elements, which are, of course, clearly tectonic, though funky ones, to say, yes, at some points this project has actually identifiable architectural elements in it, but where is the divining line? I'm fascinated by not only the sort of growth and form conversations that might have come out of Darcy Thompson, but also the notion that in making architecture we can move in and out of a kind of classical conformity, that we can probe into territories of mixing things, which I've always been interested in. A while back we did a project for a competition where we took the frightening thought that London might sink with global warming under the water, and what would happen if it did, and what would happen if we wouldn't be able to afford expensive megastructures. So this is a kind of ticky-tacky megastructure, bits of old driftwood and things left. Bye-bye. Things left which might be found in and amongst the suppurating and floating territories. And it is a weird megastructure. It's sort of deliberately creepy and sinister and sad and desolate, but it also has to do with survival. And I think it would be interesting, quick escape there, it would be interesting to wonder what would happen in your city if you started scrounging. I don't know whether you know what that word is. In other words, not attempting to have proper building, but to say, look, we can't afford proper buildings, nor do we need them. But what we can do is a bit of this and a bit of that, and a bit of this and a bit of that. I'm suggesting this morning your National Theatre, which is a disaster. Not only does the lettering fall off, but it looks as if somebody sort of peed on it. But, you know, a few tins of paint and some bits of wood and some, I don't know, fir trees in the front and a photograph of something, it might look rather cheerful. Might not be the sad object that it now is. Anyway, of course, there are certain idiosyncrasies and vegetation creeps into the project. We sometimes do quite serious projects which are looking at ecological possibilities. This was a competition made for Spain. Unfortunately, Spain ran out of money just as we won the competition. But we tried. And here we're very deliberately using combinations of computerized technology and old-time natural bits of stick stuck into water. My first blue building, which I designed with Christine Hawley, was in Berlin. It was social housing, and it was modest and cheap. The second blue building, on the other hand, had other overtones. This you may know of, and is interesting in that it is regarded by some critics as a blob building. Here's an English newspaper called The Guardian, called The Guardian, which shows the attack, the march of the blobs. Or in German, das große Blob. And in fact, in Frankfurt, there was a wonderful conference run at that time called Blobmeister. I loved it because Meister is das Deutsche Meister. Aber das Blob, Mr. Blobby, who is a famous English cartoon character, Mr. Blobby, Meister. You see, there again is a conjunction of the unlike with the unlike. And for me, the unlike with the unlike is always absolutely fascinating. To take these two opposites as sort of silly and determinate. Anyhow, I would also claim, top right photograph, top left photograph, that in fact we have in England probably one of the earliest high-tech blob buildings. We have done blobism for quite a long time. What I do like sorry, wrong way. And what I do like in Grants is you go down a back street and suddenly there's a bum hanging out. And I like that. So there it is. What's that? Of course, you see, I was explaining to somebody this morning that, in fact, I think Grants is a tough old city. It has in its Baroque times, it has these wonderful cupolas on the top of churches. It's known about modern stuff. And it's known about that for a long, long time. And therefore, we are just carrying on in a tradition, if you like. And it sits comfortably, like an old animal sitting in a basket. The simple system is a skin and a pin. And the pin goes up into the mysterious space. And up, above, out of the street, out of the open part of the building, into the mysterious space. It is a theatrical device. You go up into the unknown. You enter the unknown. Your friends are sitting downstairs eating chicken legs or whatever, and they watch you go up. You disappear into that hole and appear in a wonderful place. And having entered the wonderful place, which is very often, as it was here by the late Sol LeWitt, interpreted by other artists, it's a secret space. And then you go up onto the top needle from which you get the best views in town. So in the end, the town wins. It has many nozzles which attempt to bring in natural light. And it has one nozzle which doesn't, they all poke north except for one nozzle. And he goes like that. We call it the naughty nozzle. Because from the naughty nozzle, you get a view of the castle, which is a recreation of a very old project that we did in an exhibition. And there, in a way, is the city coming back, because the base, the best part of the building, the best exhibit is that from which you enjoy the city itself. It is not a bad looking city. It is, of course, a craft building. It's not really high-tech, it's pieces put together with pieces. And you see this in the photograph here. You see the tiled roof with a piece of tile and a piece of tile and a piece of tile. And you see the plastic roof with a piece of plastic and a piece of plastic and a piece of plastic. It hasn't really gone that far. One of the ironies of the thing, if I go right back to here, is the piece of building on the left we had to keep. It was Austrian heritage. When we won the competition, we've got to keep that iron house. It's very precious. It's the first iron building in Austria. Very special. We went to great expense to prop it up and hold it up and build behind it. And then we discovered that it had been made in Sheffield and brought on the backs of camels, or however the hell they got it there. And I thought that was wonderful. I thought, right, 19th century, some English loonies put some bits of metal down there. End of the 20th century, some English loonies put some bits of plastic down there. So much for Austrian heritage. One of the things that I also discovered, and I think this is something where my regret is not having done more buildings, is that you discover things that you would not have predicted, however many drawings and models and so on you make, which is what the effect of pieces of structure and enclosure upon the interstitial space. The space between, such as this one, is often one of the best things in the buildings. And you don't ever predict it. Some of the best things happen. Actually, some of the best things are intentional. Colin and I, for a long time, had this idea of moving from transparent to translucent, from translucent to densely translucent to dense and back again. In other words, obviating what I call the tyranny of the tradition of the window. Instead of having holes in things, you glide from one condition to another. Conceptually, this still interests me tremendously. And of course, at night, the 920 pixels of light, which are only bathroom pixels, it had to be cheap. It was crap tech, not high tech. And they can be programmed. sometimes they're programmed by artists, sometimes they're programmed to advertise, sometimes they're programmed to respond to the city. We won another competition for a theatre in Italy, in a small town called Urbania. And here again one's interest in having been a provincial, having lived as a child in smaller towns, remembering that, you know, high theatre is not the only thing that a theatre can do. Back to your theatre. What happens if you can make the steps of the theatre actually come alive? You have, after all, there are performers who will just sit out there and perform. You don't need the tip-up seats. Maybe you need the tip-up seats for very long and boring plays. Maybe you need a fly tower or very elaborate sets. But what we did was to pull our theatre out of itself and terrace it down into the marketplace, and to put bars and open performances and open-air cinema, so that it was acting as a theatre even on a wet Thursday. And that is the organisation of the theatre. Sadly, it was Italy, and the mayor got booted out, and the job collapsed. We've done a number of competitions for towers. Again, one of our competitions more recently, a tower, looks back at a very early tower that I did in the 50s, 60s, and then develops along the lines of looking at the growing of algae on a public building. How could you make a public observation tower also useful as a demonstration of growing algae? We got into the next stage of the competition, and we developed more of the algae growing apparatus. And then in our final version of the project, we also incorporated other growing technologies and wind technologies and ways of so we had solar panels and wind panels and gyrating pieces, and we were still having laboratories with algae growing as well. And then the whole thing drapes itself over the public park, which lies below it. We lost out to Fujimoto in the final analysis, but we were able to apply many of the conversations that we've had about metamorphosis and things growing within other things into the project. We like colour. You might have guessed that from the shirt, because I do. Sometimes wear black shirts. And we have done a number of competitions where, for example, here we were looking at a railway station for Birmingham. They didn't want to rebuild the station. They just wanted to skin it in colour. And there we have it as this coloured by object, and it's surrounded by a series of streets where the red part of the building is actually reflecting back the red coloured street, and the blue part of the building is looking to Jan Kaplitsky's blue bubble building, and the pale part of the street is looking at the sun, because that's the south. In another project also developing the idea of colour, this is for Taipei. It's about a half-kilometre music strip, or a series of what they called music boxes. They're recording studios and places for music performers, pop music performers. At the bottom of the picture, the blue tower is nearest to the centre of the city, and is quite a kind of almost de Stijl-like architecture, quite a sort of four-square architecture. And as you move along the scheme, the architecture becomes more drifty and more bubbly. And in fact, then, at the other end of the scheme, the architecture is not coloured at all, but the form is very sculpturesque, so that it's a sort of a double metamorphosis, if you like. It goes from brightly coloured but stiff to not coloured but loose. So in a way, in competitions such as this, obviously you always hope to win the competition, and you rarely do, but in fact one is also playing out a series of propositions. In this which was not a competition, just simply a project that I did about a place I know well because it's up the street from where I've lived for 20 years. I'm looking at different kinds of surface condition and the possibility of vegetation and coloration. Then we did another competition, which won. Sometimes they do win. And this, so far, is our largest building. It's the Law Faculty and Administration for the Vienna Economics University. I started around this time of going back to the idea of cartoons and drawing people doing things. And I said, you know, I've been going to Vienna many, many, many times, and the Viennese, they don't want to sit in boring grey boxes. They like to get pissed, they like to go off in rooms doing naughty things, they like to fall drunk under the table, they like to bullshit, they like to argue, they like to attack each other. Why can't that happen in the university? You know, why does it have to be locked up? More people leaving. And so I said, right, let's try and how can we incorporate that into the architecture? How can we make the interstitial space between the more formalized rooms, operational, and we started to develop these spaces between. We also, on the outside of the building, molded it so that we could get the sun coming in as much. We called them the sunshine corners, and inside this English term, nooks and crannies. And I'm glad to say that the final building does carry this through. It also carries through a quite deliberate attack upon the greyness of Vienna. I have been in Vienna many, many times, teaching, exhibiting, doing other things, a lot. And a lot of the time, half the year, it's cold and grey, and the inner ring of suburbs have these long, grey, cold, hard buildings. No, it's not all pretty stuff in the first district. You go behind it, what are you doing? Let's get some colour, let's bring the seaside into Vienna. Let's get some colour. And one made the colour system so that it's darker, richer colour near the ground and lighter colour towards the sky. Of course, there had been earlier conversations about that. An old drawing, again from the 70s, I was looking at the idea of striations of colour. And then, my wife and I 2 years ago, were in Valparaiso in Chile. And my God, there was somebody doing social housing in colour in a city that has a fantastic tradition of colours. Again, you think, these guys have been there before, but that doesn't stop you doing it. You say, wow, good, great, that's what I mean. And here is this stripy coloured building with its terracing. We have just been given an award and told that one of the reasons we got this award was because the people in the building like the building. They say that in Vienna, a lot of architectural critics hate the building, but all the people like it, and the public likes it. Certainly, particularly the people who work in it, they say, well, it's livened up our lives, and you've given us places where we can go and have a smoke, places where we can sit out, and places where we can gather in small numbers. It's not just a series of rooms. And that's what we set out to do. It's a large and complicated building, but actually the system is to create these interstitial spaces so that, unlike in Graz, where one is observing the power of the interstitiality after the event, here we're trying to predict it. And these are some of the spaces in between the formalized rooms. And a plan of the library, which then has a series of capsules which sit inside it. It's a double-height library. And the capsules sit in so you can hide away and do more private things. And then occasionally the building is calm with very little colour, quite calm. And here are the sunshine corners. And it has another presence at night. Here's the thing that went off on an interesting tangent. I some years ago was asked to do a drawing for an edition of AD magazine, and I had this idea for a long time about a comfortable vegetated club. Here's some old favourites, the vegetation idea, the comfort idea, and clubs, which we enjoy. And I said, here is a Comfo Veg Club. And then SIAC in Los Angeles asked me to do an installation. And I said, we'll do the Comfo Veg Club. Well, of course, the budget was very small. So we had to modify some of the ideas. But here is the first original drawing, 2 or 3 years before the actual development into the Comfo Veg Club. By some more computer drawings, of course. The Comfo Veg Club, proving itself to be extremely comfortable. In fact, so comfortable that I'm told that very naughty things happened late at night. And then all the pieces of the Comfo Veg Club have been taken to people's apartments, so it still lives. I then have done something that I've never had the opportunity of doing before, which is to take something that was made and reconvene it back into the proposition. So here is a new version of the Comfo Veg Club using the constructed part of the Comfo Veg Club as a trigger for the next stage. Quite nice to be able to do that. I've been fascinated by what people do in small towns. This was a master plan for a place called Pinto near Madrid. And here I was interested in what people do in little towns when they just hang out. You know, the guys hanging out looking at the girls hanging out looking at the guys, maybe people hanging out smoke, you know, drink in a bar, just hanging around, which is almost a dying art. And I applied that to the American tradition of the boardwalk and wrapped the boardwalk in amongst the houses, and then took one of my favourite things, which is kiosks, which I'll come to in a moment, and tucked the kiosks under the building so that you have the kind of casual architecture, the casual street, interacting with the formalised buildings in the formal street. And in a way, one was able to apply that. In Madrid itself, we got a commission for a piece of social housing, and here it is, with the kiosks tucked underneath it, and lots of jolly blinds and so on, and sports facilities on the top. But what happened was the Spanish demise. The building got up to 3rd floor, and the car park built, and it hung there for about a year and a half, and nothing happened. The builder had gone bankrupt. Finally, a builder was found from Barcelona who completed it, but it didn't have the Johnny sunblinds. Nobody could afford to open the kiosks, and the city was scared of having people on the top doing sporty things. So in a way, it's a bit of a sad version of what it might have been, which raises, of course, the whole issue of what happens if part of the building, in a sense, part of the building is there, but not the whole of it. And it also raises a very interesting intellectual issue, which is, what is the essence of the building? To what extent are these extra elements, such as the sports facilities, the blinds, the kiosks, actually quite central to the proposition of the building? Yes, sure, you can put stairs in the right place to make sure the closed cupboard works and the bath has the right length of pipe going up the wall, but that isn't the whole story. To me, more and more, these other parts are not just adjuncts, they are almost as essential as the concrete that wraps you. So it's a strange project. And sometimes we do competitions. Now, I mentioned my fascination with kiosks, and I've hardly had time to go around your town yet, but I have managed to see that you already have a tradition of kiosks, which I'm delighted, and I will spend part of tomorrow, I hope, looking at them in more detail. I think kiosks are an amazing reflection of the psychology of a town. I think you learn a lot from kiosks, and I think they are legitimate architectural concerns. Now, on the right is a drawing of a section drawing through a footbridge. In fact, we sometimes enter stupid competitions where we know we're not going to win. This was a competition for a footbridge in a neighbour of yours, sort of, I suppose, which is, I've forgotten the name of the place now. Skopje. Oh, it says so, yeah. Skopje, which I think is down the street somewhere here. And we knew that it was just a bridge between, you know, there was the plan, it was a footbridge. And I said, why don't we put a kiosk on it? And Gavin Rowbottom, my partner, said, why don't we make the kiosk move? You see, start to enliven, it can go very slowly across. You can tell the time by where the kiosk is. And I said, hey, if it moved, why don't we put a bar on the top of it? And they can have slivers or whatever the hell you have down there. And the stairs of the bar drop down at 6 o'clock. You see, so the kids can still buy a choc ice underneath them. The older people can go up and have a sliver bits and look at the view. And there it is. And we love this scheme. We knew it wasn't going to win. We just think it's such a great scheme. Sorry to say, I think it's a great scheme. I really do. And I show it at every conceivable lecture in case there's somebody sitting out there who says, well, we haven't got a footbridge, but we've got a pier, or we've got a back garden, or you know, park or something. And of course it brings together the kiosks and that. Now I have got some more slides. You'll be delighted to know there's an opportunity for more people to leave if their thumbs rich and whatever the problem is. And we moved to Australia. On a campus set up after the name of a man who immediately went to jail, which is always wrong. I mean, it's a typical Aussie situation. Mr. Bond, who was persuaded to put his name to this university, then got put in jail. I love that. Anyhow, it's a nice place. It has a Byzantine archway in the centre of it. And here, you must remember that before doing the building, I had already clocked up 47 years of teaching, or 46 years by that point, of teaching. And Gavin, my partner, had clocked up 11 years of teaching. So we had this enormous amount of years of teaching. And also, because he'd got to Harvard and the Bartlett and SciArc, and I taught to lots and lots of places, we had not only one school to refer to, but many places where one had taught, lectured, been students. And in a sense, the building is therefore the product, not only of general views about people, but anecdotal influence about particular schools. We say, you know what the ceiling does at Harvard? You know that funny crit room they have at UCLA? It's quite a good idea, because you can see the crit without being seen. You know that funny thing that they have in Frankfurt, where the roof, where we did an opening roof? You know that corridor they have at SciArc, you know, people skate down. I mean, that's quite nice. And we kept talking about places where architecture teaching went on. And so then I was persuaded by the gang to do a series of cartoons. I'm not showing you them all, but I'm showing you some of them. This is a typical crit situation, and where a rather pompous young member of the faculty is saying, "I question your terms of reference, Barbara." And there's poor Barbara there with her notes, you know, absolutely sort of sweating. And Barbara's friend Jo, who's trying to put up a drawing, is getting increasingly nervous. And there's Frank on the floor there, who is a typical Bartlett student, where they've made a fantastic gadget, which was working yesterday, and will work tomorrow, but sure as hell isn't going to work when the jury's on. But it's using electronics that do something, and the smoke comes up. And of course, it's life imitating art, because in fact, here was Barbara, with her notes. I remember her distinctly in photograph, very nervously, in front of some smart-ass West Coast teachers. And she was very nervous. And it's in SciArc, as it happened. And of course, an architecture school is a place of social intercourse. Here is a rather, I think, a guy with a bit of a no-hoper, I think, by the look of it. But he imagines that perhaps if he worked late, the chick on the other level might take an interest in them. And we have built the building, and indeed there is a dark-haired chick in the corner of the studio. And one wants, again, it's rather like in Vienna, where we want to encourage the people to be in the building as much as possible. So we're saying, you really could work all night in here. And there's these guys with, being Australia, sort of cheap wine, tearing their hair out, and some friends saying, oh, shit, you know. And the winding stair is actually constructed. Or the fact that we want to introduce certain areas of colour into the situation. And it doesn't matter if you then do a drawing, if you put drawings on top of the colour. Or the fact that this is, of course, a place of social interaction. Here we are with some happy, toothy people on the opening day, and my cartoon done about a couple of years before, saying, you know, hey, it's all happening, huh? In a very Aussie kind of, I can't quite get the accent. Hey, it's all happening. And indeed, it is. Or the view of the system of the building. I'll come on to the building in a moment. Or a bit of flattery that I did in the competition stage, suggesting that, of course, people would be dropping in from Princeton all the time. And there you see the street, which is the centre of the building. Or the typical cat and mouse situation. Don't forget that the city it's in is Gold Coast, which has about 20 kilometres of marvellous surfing beaches and many lagoons. And, you know, here's Jules, who probably has been out on the surfing beach rather more than he's been in the architecture school. Nice to see you in the building, Jules. And the other member of faculty said, oh, how come I get involved in this? Wandering off in the other. I have taught, and I always realise it's important for students to have access systems down which they can escape, and even more important for the faculty to have escape systems. There's nothing worse, particularly if you're at the head of a school, of somebody incredibly boring heading your way. You need another bit of circulation by which you can suddenly seem to vanish. It's self-preservation. Or here's another bit of anecdotal. Here is a typical small seminar situation where there's rather pompous teaching saying, you know, I think we have to establish terms of reference. And there's a guy sitting in the front who is an old student, an old you know, student who's mortgaged his house in order to come and do a master's degree. You know, he's sitting there saying, what the hell is all this about? What a load of bollocks, you know. And then, of course, life imitates art, because there I am myself in that building with the same gesture, probably with the same bullshit coming out of my mouth. It's the guy in the cartoon. And this thing that I referred to earlier about the condition in UCLA, where you are able to look at what's going on, but you pass across in a high gallery. And there it is. Reality imitating art. There were lots of other cartoons about things that go on in school. Now the organisation is very simple. There is a street which goes east-west. The north is, of course, the hot side because it's the southern hemisphere, and on the south are the studios on 2 levels. The street slightly climbed up a hill. In the competition stage, there was one more bay than in the final stage. We had to cut some corners. And we have these things that you can see in plan which we call scoops. And the scoops are the primary structure, and also places where you can do things that are not part of the curriculum. You can do casual things. You can just sit round the table, you have a small crib, etc., etc. And there you see the sister of the building with the stairs wrapping around the scoops and the trays of studio coming off on the south side. And some of Gavin's marvellous sketches, he's an amazing sketcher. And a lot of slog that goes into a building like this, and even more into the Vienna one, because it's the Vienna one, where you're actually not just doing first principles, you are actually doing a series of manoeuvres and juxtapositions and juggles and economic versions and more expensive versions. A lot of it is straight professional slog, where you work through things, particularly if you're working to a very tight budget. And then you attempt to use the technologies that you can. You attempt to rationalize the thing, and you have to spend a lot of computer time working on specials, such that we put our brightest lady onto the mathematics of the scoops for about a month and a half. And the mathematics involved the business of using as few basic components as possible. So your shuttering could be used like that, and then like that, and then like that, and then like that. And from that you got the variety of different shapes. Even then the shuttering system had to be imported from Germany. And just as in the Graz building, everybody was very nervous until they saw the first acrylic sheet being laid and that it worked. Here they were very nervous until they saw the first 2 layers of shuttering working, the first 2 casts working. And then everybody relaxes. There's always this nervousness if you're trying something that's really done before. There's a north facade which just lets the windows come where they have to come, and then does a kind of artwork of sun-shield eyebrows around it. What's interesting, I think, to talk about this in an architecture school is to say that here are the original visualizations. We won the competition from an invited list of, I think, 12 people. And they obviously, somebody liked these visuals. And I think compared with the building, the visuals are starker. They look more like German expressionism. But the form is very close to the built. So that's an interesting case. In the case of the drawings done for the classrooms, I think for the studios, I think the studios very definitely look more interesting than the drawings. And then there are various colour renditions that start to imply the use of certain materials. The effect of it dramatically, and some of our renditions made it look distinctly spooky, much more spooky than it actually does look. And in the early version, there were more expensive varieties of skinning than those that we used in the end. And then the scribbling has to stop. There's this moment, which however marvellous the scribbles are, some guy comes and digs a hole, and another guy starts to put concrete in it, and suddenly all that flim-flamming around solidifies. And the building process was relatively quick. Didn't have that many hitches. The constructors who normally put up condominiums on the seafront, I think, had not done anything like this and was shit scared of it and claimed that they lost money on it. But it's getting so many awards that they're probably making up for that in PR. Here is the main street. And there's the characteristics of the street and the fitted furniture, which was made in Gold Coast by a Paraguayan and an Englishman. A very interesting firm, brilliantly done. And the furniture was designed by us and made in China. We had the challenge, if we could make the furniture cheaper than the Australian Ministry of Education and Norm, we could get away with it. And we did, by having it made in China and watching the legs rather carefully. And of course, marvellous things happen. The whole thing is based upon designing in a place where the sun is going to do damage, but the light is wonderful. And you get quite a lot of rain, torrential rain when it happens. And there are certain conditions of the day cycle which are very, very agreeable. I think we're quite pleased with it as a piece of theatre, actually, apart from everything else. So there's the street. You have the studio side, one of Gavin's drawings of it, with its furniture in the scoops. The layers, the furniture is an interlocking system, so you can have 1 person, 2 person, 3 person, 4 person, 5 person combinations of the tables. And it's not got the full complement of students. It's only got about half the number of people that they hope to have in the building. So it's pretty loose at the moment. And then there's what I call the northern rooms, which are all the admin and the computer rooms and the toilets and the elevators and postgraduate rooms. And here is actually the rare sight of a real postgraduate. Finally, one or two postgraduates are starting to appear. Here's a real postgraduate actually entering our rooms. And this is the nose of the building, which I shall come on to in a moment, which is the main conference room and directors' rooms, which sit in the nose. Then, of course, there are the scoops in action. And the thing of also what I call percolation, not that you don't see things full fronted, but you see them gradually through. Here, it's a slightly Gothic kind of condition, that all is not immediately obvious. These glimpses, and glimpses across space. And I have a predilection for noses. I've noticed it, that we take these three of these buildings, both the Vienna building, the Graz building, and the Bonn building. They all have these noses. And I'm now rather conscious of it, that when you come into one of my buildings, there's a nose that greets you. I'm sure a psychologist would have a wonderful time with that. And of course we developed the furniture, as I've said. And the object in space is seen in that typical sort of Queensland evening, balmy evening. And one of the things is the back. I suppose it's the back. That's very sad. That's a giveaway, which obviously thought of the front and the back, because it was a busier end from all the other buildings in the campsite. There's the back. It's interesting that the back did not have as much time spent on it as the front. And we're quite pleased with it. That raises a very funny issue, that some parts of the project have worked over, and we're all drawers. So there's a lot of drawing, a lot of tweaking, a lot of cutting, a lot of that. Then the back, this sort of bump sticks up the back. It's actually quite like it. And we wondered if you didn't need to go on to all that bother. But I don't know. I think probably do. And this northern facade was very, very cheap. It was a cheapened version that would just simply let the windows come where they come and do a bit of metal eyebrow and a bit of a paint job. Again, going back to our National Theatre, if somebody just did a bit of an eyebrow and a bit of a paint job, done. We were then in a big competition, which lots of people went in for. We were in the final three, but lost out to Ashton Raggett and McDougall, a big Melbourne firm, who I rather liked, I have to admit, that we were beaten by something I don't disapprove of. Anyway, it was for the cultural centre for the Gold Coast city. Now, there's one lady in the front, two ladies in the front row who know what I mean when I sort of say the culture of the Gold Coast. My wife says actually she thinks it's the city of the future in Australia. It is the fastest growing. And we had to make a series of theatres and concert halls and little art galleries and banks of trees, a very, very large peninsula with a lake in it. Just in reference, though, Gold Coast has a very particular kind of clientele, shall I say. It's mostly mums and dads and people who get pissed on the seafront and really, you know, bringing the idea of culture. You have to rethink what you mean by culture. One of the bits of the presentation, I think, was a strip cartoon of four different sets of people and how they would find themselves surreptitiously being engaged by rather interesting things that were going on there. And again, kiosks came strongly into the project. We didn't win. Nearly won. In the last three. I'm now working on a building for the original town where I started learning architecture. And it's Blue Building number 4, which is for the Arts University of Bournemouth, which is what the institution has now become, a fully fledged university. And I've been asked to do this drawing studio. And I could take longer, but we're getting hot and it's nearly finished. art students, there is a story that goes behind each of these characters in the drawing, typical types that you get studying postgraduate art. And the enclosure for them, a simple building, which will be made in steel, blue steel, where we very carefully calculated the light conditions. It's all about light. There will be 4 conditions of light. The big north light, the bounce light from the back north light, a sliver of light which will run under the seats, and a curved gradation of light from the entrance. There'll be 4 natural light conditions. And it won't be these colours. This is merely from the constructor to show how the panel system will work. And since I'm looking back in Bournemouth, I've also been doing a sort of version of my tower system of looking what would happen if a series of towers were placed nearby, bearing in mind that it's a funny old place. It's a very funny, that part of town is very, very spooky and old and funny people. Different from the Gold Coast funny people, but still funny. And they deserve funny towers. And I'm sort of enjoying myself. And I think that's enough. Otherwise you'll all be going out the door. So you can all go out the door now. Thank you.
Thanks for the wonderful lecture. I'm sure a lot of people have questions, so we'll start immediately. Like, Püji de Gush? Yeah? You want to Püji? Somebody?
First of all, thank you for your lecture. I would like to ask about the Kunsthaus in Graz. I've been visiting Graz since I'm doing my PhD there several times, and also in the building. How would you describe this 10 years period you did the building and the strong opposition from the locals to the wider acceptance which is now or can be felt in the city?
Well, I think it's. I think it came. I had many levels of answer. I'll try and be as brief as I can. There is, of course, the personal thing of its moment in time vis-a-vis my own life cycle. Because had it not happened, I would have become, somebody with an interesting early history, a few books after my name, a sort of name in academia, if you like. And it revived my position as an architect. And Colin Punney, who I worked with, is a brilliant guy. So I was lucky as well. And I think that you have to also remember that in parallel to the architecture school, where one has been the head of an architecture school for a long time, taught for a long time, therefore you are the person who's been on the other side of the desk. I had also, for 2.5 years, been the director of a large art institution in London. I've been the director of the ICA. And I also had an outfit that, after that, put on exhibitions. So I know a lot of the things that actually go on in such a building, which are not the things that you necessarily get in the Neufert or whatever. The other thing is, of course, the condition of Graz as a whole. I think Graz is a very interesting town. I did know it before I did the building. I'd been there about 8 times. I'd been on that site sometimes with students because there used to be a bar there that stayed open virtually all night. And therefore, when we did the competition, and Colin had for a long time a girlfriend who came from Graz. We both knew the town, we both knew the site long before we actually did the project. So we knew what went on. We knew the noisy side, the quiet side, the funny bit at the back, the hotel across the street, how many trams went by. It's sort of useful, because then you can cut corners. There's no argument about where you come in. That's where you come in. There's no second guess. That's, of course, where you come. That's, of course, the beautiful bit. That's, of course, the bit you have to shield. There's that aspect. And Graz, and there were two buildings in Graz, which I think, for me, were very important, were built before ours. One was Gunter Domenic's cantina in the seminary, or whatever it is, the monastery, back behind the railway station. And the other one is Wilke Ginker's farmhouse, which I think is a wonderful building. So that already there were recent buildings that I respected. And that's the reason I used to take Stair to this place, because it's a really interesting. The Grazer Schule, I think, were very interesting group of people. And then it is a polyglot architecture. It's a city of a certain sort of grain. It shifts very rapidly. I think small cities of about that sort of size are very interesting to study because they don't have great swathes of consistency. Berlin or London or something. They shift. And therefore your insertion also has to have nuances, even if there's different sides, there's different atmospheres of sitting. They're not sitting as a free form object. They're not sitting as monumental objects. Not a city of monuments. I find that useful. In terms of what has happened since, I think that, were one to sit down and do the Kunsthaus Graz today, I would have been even more relaxed about the bits that look at the city and the bits that don't look at the city. I think that's an interesting aspect of the building. We could even develop it further. And in a sense, I think the subsequent buildings have been very concerned about looking. The other thing, I think, is the public space on the ground floor. I think we could have examined more what you do in a multi-purpose room. I've been there eating, lecturing, talking, looking at a film. And I think that there is a question to be asked now about the totality of an art museum. To what extent can you anymore just treat a Kunsthaus or Kunsthalle or an art museum as primarily to do with the exhibits or the exhibition spaces and only secondarily to do with the event spaces, because the events might be going on in the exhibition. So that one might have thought of more of bringing more people up into the body of the building. I don't know what that, I mean, I'm just trying to reconstruct in my mind. I'm delighted with the way that they've looked after it. And Peter Pakash, who I think is still just about the director of it, is a marvellous client. He really likes the building. I designed the office for him, and he has a big palazzo across the river where he can run all his 17 museums from. But he stayed in that office for much longer than he should have done because he likes the room. And I designed that knowing that it was the best room in town. I mean, that's where, the design of the director's room, as I've done again in Bonn, is something you think, if I was sitting there, I would enjoy it because I would see this and I would see that and I would get to see it down there. There are many things that come to mind. I think Graz is a city that's underrated internationally because it's not in the first tier of visitable places. It sits somewhere below Krakow or above, I don't know, Zagreb or something. But it is a very interesting city, and it's a city where you know that having done something like it, it affects the psychology of the city. I mean, that is also something which is extraordinary because, as you say, there was a survey done by one of the newspapers there that 70% of the people hated the building from pictures that were sent there. And the same percentage liked the building once it was there. And I rather like the fact they have chocolate bars with the building on t-shirts. a guy made this one final observation. It's a silly story, but when we won the competition, we had various television crews that had come to our office there, and the crew came, and the official models were somewhere on tour, so they weren't. We couldn't get hold of the model, but a baker had made a cake of the building in chocolate. It was a chocolate cake about so big of the building, very crude, in the wrong colour. It was chocolate colour. And the baker had made the cake because he was so pleased that something important was going to happen on that side of the river, because it was a kind of political statement. And the television crew just constantly, we had all these drawings all over the place, all these computer drawings, weren't remotely interested. Everything had to be filmed around the cake, which tells you, message to students, that the model, the physical model, is still something which the layperson is fascinating. But I can't tell exactly what it is. I don't know how deep your question runs around. I can't. I have to sort of assume what would have happened had I not won it at that moment. Whether I staggered into oblivion or won the next competition that came along, I don't know. It was a nice one to win, and we beat a lot of people for whom we have high regard. So that was also. I think one of the things, finally, I could go on and on about this, one of the things I did observe when they exhibited all the whatever projects was that a lot of the people, including many that I have a lot of regard for, made the buildings too complicated. Although ours is a funny-looking building, it's not that complicated. You know, and some of them had stuff doing this and this and this and that and it sort of lost the plot. So there's a sort of question. And somebody I just read before I threw out a review that somebody's done of our Australian building says actually it's just he says it's actually an orthogonal building. It's a street, it's a small rooms on the north, the large rooms on the south, and we come in there, go out there. Don't, because it does this and this and so it's romantic and so on. It's actually very straightforward. I rather like that. I take that as a compliment. I take the fact that I'm very interested in circulation, being a teacher. And Elia and I were just at breakfast recalling one of our teachers. He was an old Jewish Berliner who would say, "Walk me from there." He would take any price and say, "Walk me." And I still use this in Chris. I say, "Walk me, take me from there to there," because you know the bugger who's done the scheme hasn't thought about what you actually do. And here I invoke another piece of nostalgia. One of my favourite students at the age, many years ago was a nice lady who did a bus station. And there was this bus station. I looked at it and I said, "Amanda, do you ever go on the bus?" She said, "Yeah, I come on the bus every morning." I said, "Did you come in on the bus this morning?" "Yeah, sure, of course." "How did you get off the bus?" She had drawn the bus station according to some book, which obviously used an American bus station as its thing. She had forgotten that, of course, she would get off an English bus on the left-hand side of the bus as it goes. But she didn't extrapolate this to a project. And I noticed this over and over, and it's one of my real hobby horses, that young architects go to the computer, or to the rule system, or to the Neufeld, if there's such a thing still, or whatever, the rule, and they do it as a formula. They don't use day-to-day observation. And I love, that's why I do cartoons, because I'm interested in what, like when those people go out the door, I'm not just being rude, I'm fascinated. And here, they have to do a tricky thing, because they have to go out on a ramp, you see, and you've got a very noisy floorboard. And that adds not only to the piquancy of the situation, adds to the theatre of the situation, adds to my cynicism vis-a-vis the situation. It all goes somewhere in the back pocket. That stuff is much more useful than somebody telling you, you know, you have to have 14-meter radius of truck turning. Because sure as hell that will come into the story at some point, but also the experience. And I said to this girl, I said, just design the bus station as you would use it. And I think that's, as a teacher, the thing I find most interesting is how people have lived. Because I think if you really do observe how things happen, then you can be radical. I found the 2 towns where I can be very radical. One is Bournemouth, which I lived in a long time as an adolescent, and places like Grants or parts of London, where you're so familiar, you know that you could get away with something more than just what it tells you in the book. But you have to also know what people will really do. They don't want to walk up ramps very often, unless there's that kind of thing. Oh, I'm sorry that's a rather long answer to your question, and I may not have answered the bit that you wanted to do. There's a guy with another question, so we're all right. Oh, the mic, yes, I can do it very loud if you want me to.
You just answered also mine, so you answered the
Questions?
Oh, I've answered it? Yeah. Oh, well, that's easy. Any more that I've already answered? Lady with glasses.
Yeah. Not like yours. First of all, I like your shirt.
Thank you.
And if
How much you prevent me?
Second, if I may take the liberty to say that we visit with our professor the campus in Vienna, the new part of the city, and it really did get that feeling of full energy and yellow and orange. It really gives you that feeling you describe, especially when it's placed in the spaceship of Zaha. What I'd like to ask you, because your work is always attached to the feelings and bringing colors and happiness. This is what I felt like. What's your impression of Pristina, and what would you do? What did you see? You have a whole different situation in our city. It's not Vienna, it's not grey, it's grey but with different colors, and it's not straight. What would you do with this city?
Oh,
another nose,
right now, yeah.
balloons, bumps, what?
No, I think we haven't really, all we've had is a ride into the airport and a little bit of walk this morning, just up and down outside. So I hope tomorrow I shall tell you more. My first impression is that it looks very poor, which it probably is, and it looks incomplete. And I've heard, during the day, I've heard some sort of people who know quite a lot about it explain to me the reasons why this is. I think it would be a mistake for it to attempt to play capital city. I don't mean that politically, I mean that architecturally, urbanistically, because it's very interesting. If you take, I'll have to go round about this in a funny way. I'm very familiar with the Nordic cities, the Nordic capitals, and particularly Oslo, where I've been a guest professor for 2 periods and been researching a lot, many times. It was, of course, a suppliant city to the Swedish Empire and the Danish, and then became a capital city of its independent country. Okay, now 100 and something years ago, but what was fascinating was the fact that it then built a series of institutions as a miniature. It has a little palace which looks like Buckingham Palace, but sort of half size. It has a national theatre, but it's a big pocket size, and it's a pocket size. It's quite a charming city actually, but when it plays the monumental, apart from actually, it's, I think, very successful opera house. I think the opera house did something very original, which was to take the fact that the Norwegians are used to going up and down slopes, and it takes the building into the water. but I digress. It's interesting to compare what Oslo did with being a capital to what Stockholm did with being a capital, where, although now Oslo is probably as rich as Stockholm, but it felt itself to be a major capital. And then if you compare it with Berlin, it's sort of business, so if you compare the capitals which I'm familiar with, the mostly Northern European ones, it's interesting to see where pomposity gets you, and how cities that grew exponentially at a certain moment in their economic history were able to take advantage of it or not. And it's interesting that, say, Barcelona, which is one of my favourites, of course, has only really completed itself in recent years where they rediscovered the coast. So there are all these manipulations, some of which are to do with organisation, some are to do with fabric, some are to do with how you perceive of yourself. Now, if I was doing Kosovo, I would say, let it be a new kind of capital city. Let it not have monumental buildings. It hasn't got the bloody money for it. It's like crap tech applied to grants. You know, if there isn't money to do it, don't try it, because you only look stupid. You know, make it the city of things that happen in funny spaces. Use a lot of local technologies. Use bits of wood, bits of leftover steel. Take some of your incomplete illegal buildings and do interesting things with them. And don't do what predict, just sort of put a spin around it and sort of windows that open. And take it as an opportunity to have 5-story, 6-story, 8-story buildings that don't have to be orthodox. Use colour. Of course, I would say that, right? Although I know the Albanians are using colour, right? So maybe you don't, you know, there's always those funny things that go between adjoining countries. If the Scottish do something, the English don't want to. If the French do it, they certainly don't want to. So they do the opposite. So you're a bit near Albania to use colour, so you have to do something, maybe you have to choose 2 colours and go with them. I think you need a lot more trees than that, because it's bloody hot. And why you don't use trees is they grow. Yeah, it's not nice. You've got to do the national. I mean, I'm not necessarily bidding for the job, but I mean, if anybody asks me, I do a threatening do-over of the National Theatre. I think it's a, you know, there you are. There's this sort of attempt at a kind of boulevard, and there's your National Theatre, which looks like a sort of hen house or something. It's tragic, you know, and it only needs some paint, some bits of gunge over the front or something to put the lettering straight, which is a glue job, I suspect, or a couple of nails. I mean, it's like this degree of thoughtlessness. I think, and that, so you need to be more sophisticated about visual things, but you don't want to go pompous. Otherwise, you'll just look stupid, because all the richer cities can pump the hell out of you, you know? And that's a tricky thing. I think it needs more greenery. And use some temporary buildings. Do some, I mean, last night, and I hope we go there again, we had some margaritas or whatever it was in that bar that's underneath your tacky-looking sports station. But the bar is great. It works. You can have any old tacky old structure, a few drinks and some coloured lights and some pretty girls. You're in business. Now, why doesn't the National Theatre do that? It's cheap tricks, you know. You know what I'm saying? It's not. It's not just right. Sure, you need clever ways with roofs and clever ways with sunshades. You know, nice bridges and things. We do that. You know, give you a bridge with a kiosk on it. You've got some quite good kiosks there. I mean, it needs a longer. I can give you a longer answer on paper.
I'm sure there will be more funny situation and stripes because you haven't visited the whole part of the city, but we'll see tomorrow.
Yep.
Thank you for the answer.
Wie zit hier?
Thank you. Last month, since Biennale, I read a lot of posts from parametric movement, especially from Patrick Schumacher, trying to separate architecture from politics, from art. And now I want to see from your point of view, your philosophy, the relation between architecture and art and politics, or the other things.
I'm in the Balkans. I mean, I don't know. I mean, my wife is not English, and she always accuses me of North European bigotry or whatever the thing. The Balkans is such a screw-up. I don't know whether I'm very cynical. You see, I think, okay, of course it's related to politicians. I'm not a politician. I'm a very boring person politically. I'm a sort of liberal. I'm a kind of right-wing socialist. People aren't interested in those sorts of people because they're kind of a bit wishy-washy. I'm a sort of reasonableness. You know, I don't have strong... I voted for different parties over my lifetime. Usually the left, but not always. I vote for the least worst because they're all wankers, basically. All politicians are wankers, of course they are. You know, I think it takes a very funny psychology to be a politician, sort of somebody who wants to sort of bully, push people around. But the Balkans is such a screw-up. I have a personal view. Now, this is going to be very politically correct. I don't think you'll ever solve it. I think 1,000 years from now, you know, it's one of those places that will never sort itself out. Okay, so you'll never sort it. There'll always be trouble. And that comes back to the architecture. So you make it an architecture that can, you know, I'm always fascinated by these things that were mosques, then they were cathedrals, then they were mosques, then they were tire depots. You know, and somebody said to me, would you mind if the Kunsthaus became a department store? And I said, not really, no. You know, not that. I mean, I don't have pure sacred views of things. And when you hit a sort of funny place like here, like the Balkans, which I've never been to before, and you look at its recent history, or its old, long history, you say, come on, it's never going to sort itself out. Okay, so it's not going to sort that. So take that as an a priori position. It's not going to sort itself out. So let's carry on regardless. Have a drink, do a few buildings that somebody else will misinterpret, pull them down, shoot at them, bomb them, rebuild them, somebody won't understand what they were about, stick a minaret on the end, stick a cross on the top of it, you know, use it as a tire depot, no, use it as an art gallery, no, use the street as a bomb shelter, no, and you're a small place. That probably, while terrible things are going on elsewhere, in places that people do bother about, you might survive under the radar because nobody's noticing what's going on. Now that's not the answer you wanted, I'm sure. It's an honest answer, and it raises certain opportunities because in the bigger places, everybody's always trying to get it right, and I'm saying, look, you're never going to get it right, so let's assume that you won't. And carry on regardless. You know, there's always going to be somebody that gets up your nose, or somebody else's nose, or, you know, the wrong people. I do have a sneaking wonder, because when I was a child, there was a man called Marshal Tito. And you never heard about anywhere. It was just Marshal Tito there, at some vague place called Yugoslavia underneath it. They'd all splintered. So it's like, you know, discovering Granny was a whore or something, you know, and all suddenly comes out into the open. I'm being cynical, but I'm not being cruel, if you understand.
Yeah, of course.
I actually feel for you, but I don't feel for you as much as you want me to. Because you've got it coming. And I think anybody who doesn't like that kind of thing should clear up, you know. Go and live in the North Pole or something. I mean, I know, you know, go live in Sweden, where it's terribly boring. Unbelievably boring. Yeah. very rational and boring. You know, this lecture would have started exactly on time this week. So, you know, you pay your money and take your choice. That's my view of politics, for what it's worth.
Professor, I have a question. Here, yeah. Your buildings looks very happy. Is that for the reason for your? Is that expression of your personality, or you want to spread the happiness to the city and the citizens?
I'm a miserable old bugger, really. I think this, that in recent years, a lot of, probably not here, I don't know, but in lots of places, architects take themselves terribly seriously. And particularly at some of the famous places. I'm just about to go and teach a bit this autumn in one such place. It fascinates me to know what I will make of it. It's Harvard. And they go around with sort of, you know, severe looks, and they don't laugh very much. And they're on juries and they say like that, and you know, I question your terms of reference. They sort of, you know, they don't smoke. Not that I do, but they don't smoke. They sort of only have one glass of wine, and they kind of quote Proust, and then they quote unreadable French philosophers, you know. And then they do extremely boring buildings. You know, really like the Swiss, you know, and all that. And it pisses me off. And my only way of reacting to that pissing off is to do what I do. Wear this shirt and try and have a bit of a laugh, you know. But I'm actually very serious about architecture. I love architecture. It matters to me how that bloody bit of wood hits that column and how somebody didn't know what to do at the end there with that piece of splayed timber there. But I enjoy the... and I feel very... totally isolated, but there are not many of us. There are far more of them. Far more, particularly the young. The young are you know, I'm the old man speaking. I'm rubbish. I don't think they're rubbish, I think they're very bright, but they do very boring things, architecture. And they all want to be seen to be correct. They all want to be seen to be doing the right thing. You didn't hear this before, but I taught at where you teach for one winter, and I didn't enjoy it. It was the first place I taught it where the students didn't sort of bounce. They were all terribly careful. They were all sort of looking at them, quoted the right quotation. And Mark asked me back, and I sort of made excuses not to come because I didn't like it. I thought they were sort of... The only interesting ones were the South Americans. All the American students at Columbia were really and it pisses me off. I can't take that. I don't like that. It's not what it's about. So does that answer your question?
De le petit titre.
What's that mean?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I've studied in at Oxford Brookes, and we've used.
Well, never mind.
Yeah, never mind. Yeah. We've used you as presidents a lot of times, and everyone in uni has. And
you use what?
For you as Archigram for president for our work. But you know, I can see you're slightly blunt. You've got a slightly blunt and slightly cynical personality, and I can see that reflected in your architecture, you know, and which I love, by the way. But I always thought, you know, we all loved your work, but in uni no one dared copy or like, you know, do work that you kind of, you know, blunt architecture. So what I'm asking is, did that, you know, your bravery with your architecture started since a student, since you were a student, or did that kind of evolve with your work?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Did you have David Green teaching you at Oxford?
No.
As a student in the small school, which we started at 16, I was energetic. I couldn't draw very well, but I found tricks of looking as if I could draw well. I mean, I could go into great length on that. When I got to the AA, I was a spotty provincial because there was lots of very smart sort of London types when I got there. It was just something the cat brought in from the provinces. Until I had it's a very interesting thing in a hot school. In a non-hot school, if you're a sort of jolly person, you get invited to everything. In a hot school, you're almost ostracized until you do something that people think is good, work-wise. And I had a very successful crit about 7 weeks into the school. And I got instantly invited to parties. Now that is I mention this because it's also rather characteristic of both the AA and the Bartlett right now, I think, that there's schools where if you are a highly regarded producer, creator, whatever, you are also successful socially. And if you're just sort of not very good, people don't want to have much to do with you. It's a very rough, vicious system. But I was quite quiet when I was a student at the AA. I did quite well and produced lots of stuff. And then I think when I finished, it was, I don't know, I sort of went back to being more of a seaside. I went into a rotate. I was more seasidey after I finished it. I sort of listened a lot. I had a very strong group of people teaching and influencing me at that time. I had my work cut out just doing the stuff. But I was quite quiet. I wasn't in the major social circuit. You know, as a sort of trendy London person, but we made up for it afterwards. And I think it's choosing your moment when you feel ready to be articulate. The same when you're on a crit, you know, when you're on a jury with other people who are interesting to listen to. You choose your moment, and then you come in when you formulated your idea. It's for the observer to see, because I can be quite crabby. I'm much more straight up and down as a tutor, as a teacher, than you would expect. I mean, I'm interested in how the building works, and how the structure works. Then you can do anything. If it works, then wow! I love people who are eccentrics. But only if the stuff works. If it's just a wank, you know, then I'm not interested.
Thank you.
No questions. So, Peter, thank you for everything.